The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood in her private sitting room, her hands trembling slightly as she held the cream-colored envelope that had arrived with the early morning post. The royal seal on the back seemed heavier than usual, and she knew without opening it that this letter would change everything. William had left early that morning for a series of official engagements in Scotland. Their goodbye had been rushed, typical of their busy lives filled with royal duties and responsibilities. He had kissed her forehead quickly, promising to call that evening, unaware that by the time he returned, their world would be completely different. The letter was from Buckingham Palace, marked with the highest level of confidentiality. Catherine's heart raced as she broke the seal with careful precision. The words on the cream paper seemed to blur together at first, but, as she read them again, their meaning became crystal clear. The palace had received intelligence about a serious security threat, one that required immediate and drastic action. The threat wasn't just against any member of the royal family. It was specifically targeted at William. The intelligence suggested that a well-organized group had been planning an attack for months, and they had detailed knowledge of his schedule, his routes, and his security protocols. The letter outlined an immediate plan that would require William to be relocated to an undisclosed location for an indefinite period. Catherine sank into her favorite armchair, the same one where she had nursed each of their 3 children, where she had read them countless bedtime stories, where she and William had shared quiet moments away from the public eye. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was receiving news that would separate them in the very place that had witnessed so many of their intimate family moments. The letter continued with clinical precision, outlining the steps that needed to be taken. William would not be able to return to Kensington Palace. He would not be able to maintain regular contact with his family. All communication would need to go through secure channels and would be limited to essential information only. The children would need to be told that their father was away on extended royal duties, nothing more. As Catherine processed this information, her mind raced through all the implications. George, their eldest, had been struggling with the pressures of knowing he would one day be king. Charlotte was in the middle of an important school project about family heritage. Louis, still so young, asked for his papa every night before bed. How could she possibly explain William's sudden absence without terrifying them or revealing the truth? The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Patterson, their longtime housekeeper, appeared at the doorway with her usual warm smile, carrying a tea service on a silver tray. She had been with the family for years and had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong. "Your Royal Highness, I thought you might enjoy some tea this morning," Mrs. Patterson said, her Scottish accent adding warmth to her words. As she set down the tray, she noticed Catherine's pale complexion and the letter still clutched in her hands. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Catherine managed a weak smile, quickly folding the letter and placing it face down on the side table. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Just some unexpected news about changes to our schedule." Mrs. Patterson had worked for the royal household long enough to recognize when discretion was required. She simply nodded, poured the tea with practiced efficiency, and quietly withdrew, closing the door behind her. Catherine was grateful for the woman's intuition and professionalism. Alone again, Catherine picked up her phone to call William, then remembered that the letter had specifically instructed her not to communicate anything about the situation over regular phone lines. Everything had to go through the security protocols established by the palace. She felt more isolated than she had ever felt in her years as a member of the royal family. The morning continued with its usual rhythm, despite the chaos in Catherine's mind. The children needed to be prepared for school, staff needed direction for the day's activities, and her own schedule was filled with appointments that would need to be maintained to avoid suspicion. She moved through these tasks mechanically, her thoughts constantly returning to William and the danger he was apparently in. As she helped Louis with his breakfast, his innocent chatter about wanting to show Papa his new drawing when he got home made her heart ache. George, always observant for his age, noticed his mother's distracted demeanor and asked if she was feeling well. Catherine reassured him with a practiced royal smile, the same one she had perfected for countless public appearances. The morning school run proceeded normally, with Catherine driving the children herself, as she often did when their schedules allowed. The familiar routine of checking seat belts, discussing the day ahead, and listening to their excited chatter about upcoming events provided a temporary distraction from the weight of the secret she now carried. After dropping the children at school, Catherine returned to the palace to find that a security briefing had been scheduled for later that morning. The briefing would provide more details about the threat and the measures being taken to protect William. She would finally get some answers, but she wasn't sure if those answers would provide comfort or increase her anxiety. The hours between the school run and the security briefing felt endless. Catherine tried to focus on her correspondence, responding to letters from various charitable organizations she supported, but her concentration was shattered. Every word she wrote felt meaningless in the context of what she now knew about their situation. When the time for the briefing finally arrived, Catherine was escorted to a secure room deep within Kensington Palace that she had never seen before. The room was windowless and sterile, with sophisticated communication equipment lining the walls. 3 serious-looking individuals in dark suits were waiting for her, along with Sir James Whitmore, the palace's head of security, whom she had known for years. Sir James began the briefing with characteristic directness. The threat against William was credible and immediate, based on intelligence gathered from multiple international sources. The group responsible had been monitoring the royal family's activities for months and had demonstrated sophisticated planning capabilities. Their target was specifically William, and their motivation appeared to be political, tied to recent government policies that the group opposed. The details of the threat were more serious than Catherine had initially understood from the letter. The group had acquired detailed floor plans of Kensington Palace, information about the children's school schedules, and knowledge of William's security protocols. They had been planning what appeared to be a kidnapping attempt, with the intention of using William as leverage for political demands. Catherine listened to these details with growing horror, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. The clinical way the security officials discussed the threat made it seem almost surreal, but the gravity of their expressions left no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. The security team explained that William had been intercepted during his trip to Scotland and was already being moved to a secure location. The decision had been made to act immediately rather than risk allowing him to return home, where the threat level was considered too high. This meant that Catherine and the children would need to continue their normal routines while William remained in protective custody at an undisclosed location. The most difficult part of the briefing came when Sir James explained the communication restrictions. All contact between Catherine and William would need to be routed through secure channels and monitored by security personnel. Personal conversations would be limited and could not include any details about daily life that might compromise security. The children would not be allowed to speak directly to their father until the threat had been neutralized. Catherine felt as though the walls of the secure room were closing in on her as she absorbed this information. The idea of not being able to speak freely with her husband, of not being able to share the small daily moments that made up their life together, felt like a form of torture. She thought about all the conversations they had every day, discussions about the children, plans for the weekend, shared jokes about things they had seen or heard. All of that would be suspended indefinitely. The security team assured her that every effort was being made to identify and neutralize the threat as quickly as possible, but they could not provide a timeline for when William might be able to return home safely. The investigation was ongoing, and until they were certain that all members of the group had been apprehended, William would need to remain in protective custody. As the briefing concluded, Catherine was given a secure communication device and detailed instructions on how to use it. She was also provided with a cover story to explain William's absence to staff, friends, and family members who were not cleared to know about the security situation. The story involved an urgent diplomatic mission that required William's immediate attention and would keep him away for an unspecified period. Walking back through the palace corridors after the briefing, Catherine felt as though she was moving through a dream. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but her entire world had been turned upside down. The familiar paintings on the walls, the polished surfaces, the carefully arranged flowers, all of it seemed to belong to a different life, one where her family was safe and together. The afternoon brought the usual responsibilities of royal life. Catherine had a meeting with representatives from one of her patronages, a children's charity that worked with families in crisis. The irony of discussing other families' struggles while dealing with her own family's crisis was not lost on her, but she found some comfort in focusing on work that had meaning and purpose. During the meeting, Catherine found herself thinking about the families the charity helped, parents who had to make difficult decisions to protect their children, families who were separated by circumstances beyond their control. She had always felt empathy for these situations, but now she understood them in a way she never had before. The meeting concluded with Catherine committing to a series of visits to the charity's facilities over the coming months. As she made these commitments, she wondered where William would be when those visits took place, whether he would be able to return to the normal rhythms of royal life, or whether their family would still be living under the shadow of this threat. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine began to realize that the most challenging part of this ordeal would be the need to maintain a facade of normalcy. She would need to continue with her royal duties, appear at scheduled events, and interact with staff and friends as though nothing had changed. The weight of this deception felt almost as heavy as the worry about William's safety. The time to collect the children from school arrived, and Catherine once again found herself in the familiar routine of the school run. As she drove to the school, she practiced the words she would use to explain their father's absence. The cover story provided by the security team felt hollow and insufficient, but it was what she had to work with. George was the first to ask about William during the drive home. He had expected his father to be there when he got home, and Catherine's explanation about urgent royal duties seemed to satisfy him for the moment. Charlotte accepted the news with the resilience that children often show, already making plans for things to show Papa when he returned. Louis, still young enough to be easily distracted, was more interested in the snack Catherine had brought for the car ride home. The evening routine proceeded much as it always did, but with a notable absence that seemed to fill every room of their home. Catherine helped with homework, supervised bath time, and read bedtime stories, all while feeling as though she was performing these familiar tasks with a part of herself missing. When the children were finally asleep, Catherine sat in her bedroom holding the secure communication device she had been given. She had been told that William would try to make contact that evening, and she found herself both desperate to hear his voice and terrified of what the conversation might reveal about their new reality. The device finally buzzed with an incoming call, and Catherine answered it with trembling hands. William's voice came through clearly, but she could immediately hear the strain and worry in his tone. They spoke carefully, both aware that their conversation was being monitored, both struggling to find ways to communicate their feelings within the constraints of the security protocols. William assured her that he was safe and being well cared for, but he couldn't provide any details about his location or situation. Catherine updated him on the children and their activities, careful not to include any information that might be considered sensitive. The conversation felt stilted and artificial, nothing like their usual easy communication. As they prepared to end the call, both Catherine and William struggled with how to say goodbye. They couldn't speak freely about their feelings or concerns, couldn't make plans for when they might speak again, couldn't even express their love for each other in the natural way they always had. The goodbye they shared that night was indeed spoken without words, conveyed through pauses, sighs, and the unspoken understanding of what they both were enduring. After the call ended, Catherine sat in the darkness of her bedroom, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The silence of the palace at night, usually comforting, now felt oppressive. She thought about all the nights she and William had talked quietly in this room, sharing their thoughts about the day, planning for the future, simply enjoying each other's company. Those moments now seemed like precious memories from a different life. The weight of maintaining her secret, of protecting the children from worry while dealing with her own fear, settled over Catherine like a heavy blanket. She knew that tomorrow would bring another day of pretending that everything was normal, of smiling for staff and visitors while her heart ached with worry for her husband's safety. As she finally tried to sleep, Catherine's mind raced with questions about the future. How long would this situation continue? Would William be safe wherever he was being held? How would the children react as the days passed without their father? How would she find the strength to maintain this facade indefinitely? The moonlight streaming through her bedroom windows illuminated the empty space where William should have been, a physical reminder of the invisible goodbye they had been forced to share. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to find some peace in the knowledge that the security team was working around the clock to resolve the threat. But sleep remained elusive as her mind continued to process the dramatic changes that had transformed her life in the space of a single day. 3 days had passed since William's sudden departure, and Catherine was beginning to understand the true weight of the burden she now carried. Each morning brought the same crushing realization as she woke to an empty bed, and the stark reminder that her husband was somewhere unknown, protected but unreachable. The palace staff had noticed nothing unusual in her demeanor. Years of royal training had taught her to maintain composure under any circumstances. But The effort required to project normalcy was exhausting her. The secure communication device had become her lifeline and her torment. William called every evening at exactly 8 o'clock, but their conversations were brief and carefully monitored. They spoke in the coded language of people who knew every word was being scrutinized, discussing the weather when they meant their feelings, talking about the children's activities when they meant their desperate longing to be together again. Catherine had developed a routine around these calls that had become almost ritualistic. She would ensure the children were settled for the night, dismiss the staff, and sit in the small study adjacent to their bedroom, where she could speak privately. The room had become her sanctuary, the only place where she could let her guard down even slightly, though she knew she had to be careful even there. On this particular morning, Catherine received an unexpected visitor. Her sister Pippa arrived unannounced, something she rarely did given the security protocols surrounding royal residences. Catherine's heart sank as she realized she would need to maintain her facade with someone who knew her too well to be easily fooled. Pippa entered the morning room with her usual bright energy, carrying flowers from her garden and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she expected to find Catherine in her normal cheerful spirits. Instead, she found her sister sitting at the breakfast table, still in her dressing gown despite the late hour, staring abstractedly at a cup of tea that had gone cold. "Kate, darling, you look terrible," Pippa said with characteristic directness, setting down the flowers and taking a seat across from her sister. "Where's William? I tried calling him yesterday about James's birthday party next month, but his office said he was unavailable." Catherine felt panic rise in her throat. She had prepared for questions from the children, from staff, from official contacts, but she hadn't adequately prepared for questions from family members who would notice inconsistencies in her story. Pippa knew their schedules, knew their patterns, knew when something was genuinely unusual. "He's away on royal duties," Catherine managed, using the same words she had practiced for days. "Something urgent came up in Scotland, and it's taking longer than expected to resolve." Pippa's expression shifted from concern to suspicion. She had grown up with Catherine, had seen her through every crisis and celebration, and she could read her sister's emotions like a familiar book. Something in Catherine's tone, in the way she couldn't quite meet her eyes, in the tension she held in her shoulders, told Pippa that this explanation was not the whole truth. "Kate, I know you better than that," Pippa said gently. "What's really going on? You look like you haven't slept properly in days, and this story about Scotland doesn't feel right. William would have mentioned something this significant when we had dinner last week." Catherine felt the weight of her secret pressing against her chest like a physical force. The desire to confide in someone, to share the burden she had been carrying alone, was almost overwhelming. Pippa was her sister, her closest friend, someone she had always been able to trust with anything. But the security briefing had been explicit about who could and could not be informed about the situation. "I can't discuss it," Catherine said finally, the words coming out more sharply than she intended. "Please, Pippa, I need you to trust me on this. Everything is fine, William is safe, and I just need some space right now." The hurt that flashed across Pippa's face was immediate and unmistakable. In all their years as sisters, Catherine had never shut her out so completely. They had shared everything: childhood fears, romantic troubles, the pressures of Catherine's entry into royal life, the challenges of raising children in the public eye. This sudden wall between them felt unnatural and painful. Pippa spent the rest of her visit trying to act normally, discussing mutual friends and family plans, but the atmosphere remained strained. When she finally left, her goodbye was cooler than usual, and Catherine knew she had damaged something important in their relationship. The security measures designed to protect William were creating casualties in other areas of their life. That afternoon brought another challenge in the form of George's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, who had requested a brief meeting about George's recent behavior at school. Catherine arrived at the school with the same composure she brought to all her public appearances, but she was unprepared for what Mrs. Henderson had to report. "George has been unusually quiet this week," Mrs. Henderson explained as they sat in the small conference room adjacent to George's classroom. "He's always been a thoughtful child, but lately he seems distracted and anxious. Yesterday he asked me several times when his father would be coming to the school play next week. When I suggested he ask you about it, he said you seemed too worried to talk about Papa lately." Catherine felt her carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. George, at his young age, was already showing the perceptiveness that would one day serve him as king, but Right now it was threatening to expose the very secret she was trying to protect him from. Children were often more observant than adults gave them credit for, and George had clearly noticed changes in the household that the adults around him had missed. His father is away on royal duties. Catherine repeated the familiar explanation, but even to her own ears it sounded hollow and rehearsed. I'll speak with George about managing his expectations regarding the school play. Mrs. Henderson nodded politely, but Catherine could see the teacher's continued concern. School staff were trained to notice changes in children's behavior that might indicate problems at home, and George's recent anxiety would be something they would continue to monitor. Catherine realized she would need to work harder to help George manage his emotions without revealing the true reason for his father's absence. The drive home from school was quiet, with George sitting pensively in the back seat while Charlotte chattered about her day and Louis dozed in his car seat. Catherine found herself watching George in the rearview mirror, noting the way he stared out the window with an expression far too serious for a child his age. She made a mental note to spend individual time with him that evening, to try to provide some reassurance without compromising security. Back at the palace, Catherine's afternoon was filled with the usual administrative tasks that came with her royal role. She reviewed proposals for upcoming charitable events, approved changes to her schedule, and participated in a conference call about a new initiative she was launching. The routine nature of these activities provided some distraction from her personal turmoil, but she found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on details that seemed trivial in comparison to the larger crisis her family was facing. During a brief break between meetings, Catherine stepped onto one of the palace's private terraces, seeking fresh air and a moment of solitude. The gardens spread out before her, meticulously maintained and beautiful, but she found no comfort in their familiar beauty. Everything reminded her of William, the bench where they often sat together in the evenings, the pathway where they walked while discussing their days, the rose garden where he had proposed years ago. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Catherine's heart jumped with the hope that it might be some communication from William outside their scheduled evening call. Instead, it was a message from her mother, asking about plans for a family gathering the following weekend. The message was innocuous, but it represented another relationship that was being strained by the secrets Catherine was forced to keep. Catherine had always been close to her parents, and her mother had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong with any of her children. The family gathering would require Catherine to maintain her facade for several hours in the company of people who knew her best, while also managing the children's questions about why their father wasn't there. The prospect felt overwhelming. As evening approached, Catherine prepared for her daily call with William with the same mixture of anticipation and dread that had become routine. She settled into the study, ensured the door was closed, and waited for the secure device to signal an incoming call. When William's voice finally came through, she could immediately hear that the strain was affecting him as much as it was affecting her. "How are the children?" William asked, as he did every evening, and Catherine could hear in his voice the same careful control she had been exercising all day. "They're well," Catherine replied, then paused, trying to find a way to communicate her concerns about George without saying anything that might worry William unnecessarily or compromise security. "George is asking questions about the school play next week." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Catherine knew that William understood immediately what she meant. George's school play was something William had been looking forward to, something he had marked on his calendar weeks in advance. Missing it would be devastating for both father and son, but there was no way to predict when this situation might be resolved. "Tell him that I'm thinking about him," William said finally, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to suppress. "Tell him that I wish I could be there, and that I'm proud of him no matter what." Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of messages she would need to convey to their children without revealing why their father couldn't deliver them himself. Every conversation with William left her with more emotional burdens to carry, more careful explanations to craft, more normalcy to project, while her world remained in chaos. "I miss you," Catherine said quietly, knowing that even this simple statement was risky given that their conversation was being monitored, but needing to say something real and honest. "I miss you too," William replied, and in those words Catherine heard all the longing and frustration and love that he couldn't express more fully. They had learned to communicate in these brief moments of honesty scattered throughout their careful conversations, finding ways to touch each other's hearts despite the barriers that had been erected around them. After the call ended, Catherine sat in the darkened study for several minutes before returning to the normal evening routine with the children. Bath time, story time, tucking them into bed, answering their questions about tomorrow's plans. All of it felt surreal, like performing in a play where she had forgotten most of her lines and was improvising her way through each scene. Louis was the easiest to settle, still young enough to accept simple explanations and distractions. Charlotte required more attention, wanting to discuss her school project about family trees and asking detailed questions about royal history that Catherine answered automatically while her mind remained elsewhere. George was the most challenging, sitting quietly through his bedtime routine, but clearly carrying worries he didn't know how to express. "Mama," George said as Catherine was about to turn off his light. "Is Papa coming home soon?" The question was direct and innocent, but it pierced Catherine's heart like a blade. George was old enough to sense that something significant was happening, but young enough to believe that his parents could fix anything if they chose to. The trust in his eyes as he asked the question made Catherine's throat tighten with unshed tears. "I hope so, darling," Catherine managed, settling on the edge of his bed and smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Papa is working on something very important, and he'll come home as soon as he can." George nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation as he had learned to accept many things about his unusual family life. But Catherine could see that he wasn't entirely satisfied, and she knew that his questions would become more pointed as time passed. Children had a way of sensing when adults were keeping significant secrets, and George was already showing signs of the intuition that would one day serve him as a leader. After the children were settled, Catherine walked through the palace corridors, checking on staff and ensuring that everything was prepared for the next day. These evening rounds had become more important to her since William's departure, providing a sense of structure and purpose when everything else in her life felt uncertain. The familiar routine of checking locks, reviewing schedules, and confirming security arrangements helped ground her in the immediate present. Mrs. Patterson was in the kitchen, finishing the final preparations for the next day's meals. She looked up as Catherine entered, and for a moment their eyes met with a shared understanding that went beyond words. Mrs. Patterson had worked for royal households long enough to recognize when a family was under strain, and while she would never ask inappropriate questions, her presence had become a source of quiet comfort for Catherine. "Is there anything else you need this evening, Your Royal Highness?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her Scottish accent carrying its usual warmth and concern. "No, thank you, Mrs. Patterson," Catherine replied. "Everything is perfect, as always." It was a small lie, but one that maintained the boundary between employer and employee while acknowledging the care that Mrs. Patterson showed for the family. These small interactions with staff had become more precious to Catherine since William's departure, reminders that she wasn't completely alone even when she felt most isolated. Later, as Catherine prepared for bed in the empty master bedroom, she found herself going through William's things, his books on the nightstand, his jacket hanging in the wardrobe, his cologne still faintly scenting the air. These physical reminders of his presence were both comforting and painful, evidence of a normal life that had been interrupted but not erased. She picked up one of William's books, a biography of a historical figure they had discussed over dinner just a week ago. The bookmark was still in place where he had stopped reading, and Catherine could imagine him sitting in his usual chair by the window, reading while she worked on correspondence or checked the children's homework. That peaceful domestic scene now seemed like a memory from years ago rather than days. The secure communication device sat silently on the nightstand, dark and inert until the next evening's call. Catherine found herself staring at it, willing it to ring with news that the threat had been resolved and William could come home. But she knew that such news was unlikely to come quickly, and that she needed to find ways to sustain herself and protect the children through what could be weeks or even months of separation. As she finally turned off the lights and tried to sleep, Catherine's mind wandered to all the other royal families throughout history who had faced separation and danger. She thought about previous generations who had endured wars, abdications, and political upheavals while maintaining their public duties and protecting their children. The weight of history and tradition provided some perspective, but it couldn't diminish the very personal pain of missing her husband and fearing for his safety. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams and worries that chased each other through her subconscious. Catherine found herself waking frequently, reaching instinctively for William's side of the bed and finding only empty space. Each time she woke, Reality crashed over her anew. The threat, the separation, the uncertainty about when their family would be whole again. The night stretched endlessly, filled with the sounds of the palace settling around her and the weight of secrets that grew heavier with each passing hour. Catherine realized that this was only the beginning of what could be a very long ordeal, and that she would need to find reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed to protect her children and maintain her royal duties while living with the constant worry about William's safety. In the darkness of her bedroom, surrounded by the familiar luxury of palace life, but feeling more vulnerable than she had ever felt, Catherine faced the reality that their goodbyes spoken without words might need to sustain them both for much longer than either of them had imagined possible. 2 weeks had passed since that morning when Catherine's world had been turned upside down by a single letter. The initial shock had given way to a grinding routine of carefully managed normalcy, but the strain was beginning to show in ways that even her royal training couldn't completely hide. The children had stopped asking when Papa would be home, which somehow felt worse than their constant questions had been. Catherine stood in the bathroom that morning, studying her reflection in the mirror with growing concern. Dark circles shadowed her eyes despite the careful application of concealer, and her face had taken on the drawn quality of someone living under constant stress. She had lost weight without noticing, and her usual energy had been replaced by a brittle determination to get through each day without breaking. The morning brought an unexpected challenge in the form of a call from Buckingham Palace. Catherine's private secretary, James Morrison, appeared at her study door with an expression that immediately put her on high alert. In his 15 years of royal service, Morrison had perfected the art of delivering difficult news with diplomatic calm, but she could see tension in his usually composed demeanor. "Your Royal Highness, I've received a call from Buckingham Palace regarding your schedule for next week," Morrison began, consulting his ever-present tablet. "The Queen Consort has requested your attendance at a private family dinner on Thursday evening. It appears she has some concerns she wishes to discuss with you personally." Catherine felt her heart sink. The Queen Consort had always been perceptive and caring, but she was also someone who noticed when things were not as they should be within the royal family. A private dinner invitation, particularly one framed around concerns, suggested that Catherine's carefully maintained facade might not be as effective as she had hoped. Did Her Majesty indicate the nature of her concerns? Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Morrison's diplomatic training was evident in his careful response. "She mentioned that she had noticed you seemed somewhat strained lately, and that Prince William's extended absence from public engagements had raised questions among other family members. She felt it would be appropriate to offer her support during what she assumes must be a challenging time." The irony was not lost on Catherine that the very people the security measures were designed to protect were the ones who posed the greatest risk to maintaining the cover story. Other members of the royal family knew William's patterns, his commitments, his usual behavior. His prolonged absence without explanation was bound to raise questions among people who understood the intricate workings of royal life. Catherine spent the morning preparing for what felt like an impossible balancing act. She would need to attend the dinner with the Queen Consort, deflect questions without appearing evasive, and somehow convince a woman known for her intuition that everything was normal while protecting classified information that she couldn't share even with family members. The afternoon brought its own complications when Catherine's phone rang with a call from King Charles's private office. The conversation was brief, but significant. The king had requested a private audience with Catherine the following day to discuss family matters. The carefully neutral language couldn't disguise the fact that William's absence had been noted at the highest levels of the royal family. Catherine realized she was facing a crisis within a crisis. The security threat that had necessitated William's protective custody was now creating secondary problems that threatened to expose the very situation they were trying to keep secret. The more questions that were asked, the more difficult it would become to maintain the cover story, and the more people would become suspicious that something significant was being hidden from them. That evening's call with William was particularly difficult. When Catherine explained about the upcoming meetings with family members, she could hear the frustration in William's voice even through the careful monitoring of their conversation. He was dealing with his own challenges in protective custody, isolation from his family, inability to maintain his royal duties, and the constant awareness that dangerous people were actively seeking to harm him. "I hate that you're dealing with this alone," William said, his voice tight with emotion. "These meetings, the questions, none of this should be your burden to carry." Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of all the conversations she had navigated alone, all the explanations she had crafted, all the emotional energy she had expended in maintaining their secret. She wanted to tell him about George's nightmares, about Charlotte's declining grades, about Louis's regression in his toilet training. She wanted to share how exhausted she was, how much she needed his partnership in managing their family during this crisis. "I'm managing," she said instead, knowing that adding to William's worry would serve no purpose when he was powerless to help. "The children are resilient, and we're all counting the days until you can come home." But, privately, Catherine was beginning to wonder if she really was managing as well as she claimed. The constant vigilance required to maintain their cover story was exhausting, and the emotional toll of separation from William was affecting every aspect of her life. She found herself making small mistakes, forgetting appointments, losing track of conversations, struggling to concentrate on even simple tasks. The next morning brought the meeting with King Charles, and Catherine prepared for it with the same careful attention she would give to a state dinner. She chose her clothing to project confidence and normality, practiced her explanations in the mirror, and rehearsed answers to questions she anticipated he might ask. The meeting took place in the king's private study at Clarence House, a room Catherine had been in many times for family gatherings and official discussions. But this felt different, more formal, more serious, weighted with unspoken concerns about William's prolonged absence and Catherine's visible strain. King Charles greeted her with his usual warmth, but Catherine could immediately see the worry in his eyes. As William's father, he had noticed changes that went beyond simple professional concerns. William's absence from family events, his lack of communication with other family members, and Catherine's obvious stress had created a pattern that demanded explanation. "My dear Catherine," the king began once they were seated in comfortable chairs near the window overlooking the garden, "I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I'm concerned about you and the children. William's extended absence, combined with your obvious strain, suggests that something more significant than routine royal duties is keeping him away." Catherine had prepared for this moment, but sitting across from William's father, seeing the genuine concern and love in his eyes, made her careful explanations feel inadequate and cruel. King Charles had always treated her as a daughter, and now she was forced to maintain secrets from him that felt like a betrayal of their relationship. "Your Majesty, I appreciate your concern," Catherine replied, falling back on the formal mode of address that created some distance from the personal nature of the conversation. "William is indeed engaged in important work, and while his absence is difficult for all of us, everything is progressing as it should." The king studied her face with the acute perception that came from decades of reading people and situations. Catherine could see that her explanation had not satisfied him, and that her refusal to provide more specific information was itself providing information about the unusual nature of William's absence. "Catherine, I've been in public life long enough to recognize when someone is carrying a burden they cannot share," the king said gently. "While I respect that there may be things you cannot tell me, I want you to know that support is available if you need it. The children's education, your public commitments, the practical aspects of managing alone, none of these should suffer because of circumstances beyond your control." The kindness in his voice nearly broke Catherine's carefully maintained composure. The offer of support was genuine and would be valuable, but accepting it would require explanations she couldn't provide. She found herself caught between gratitude for his concern and frustration at her inability to accept the help he was offering. The meeting concluded with polite but unsatisfying pleasantries, and Catherine left feeling that she had damaged another important relationship in service of protecting information that felt increasingly burdensome. The web of secrecy was creating isolation at every level of her life, separating her not just from William, but from the family and support systems that had always been her foundation. That afternoon brought news that changed everything. Sir James Whitmore arrived at Kensington Palace with a security update that carried both hope and new complications. The investigation had made significant progress, with several members of the threat group apprehended and their plans disrupted. However, the lead suspect remained at large, and intelligence suggested that the threat against William might actually be increasing as the group became more desperate. The security team had made a decision that William needed to be moved again to a location with even higher security measures. This move would require additional communication restrictions, potentially reducing Catherine's contact with her husband to written messages passed through security channels. The nightly phone calls that had been her lifeline for 2 weeks might need to be suspended indefinitely. Catherine listened to this briefing with growing horror. Just as she was beginning to adapt to the current situation, the rules were changing again in ways that would make everything more difficult. The prospect of losing even her limited direct contact with William felt like being asked to survive underwater without breathing apparatus. For how long? Catherine asked, her voice barely controlled. Sir James's expression was sympathetic but firm. I'm afraid we cannot provide a timeline, Your Royal Highness. The suspect's behavior has become increasingly erratic, and we need to prioritize the prince's safety above all other considerations. That evening, Catherine faced the possibility that her call with William might be their last for an indefinite period. When his voice came through the secure device, she could immediately hear that he had already been briefed about the changes. They both knew they might have only minutes to say things that would need to sustain them through an even longer separation. Kate, listen to me carefully, William said, his voice urgent despite the need to maintain security protocols. Whatever happens in the coming weeks, remember that none of this changes anything fundamental about us. This situation is temporary, even if it doesn't feel that way. Catherine gripped the communication device tightly, trying to memorize the sound of his voice, the particular way he said her name, the tone he used when he was trying to comfort her. She wanted to tell him so many things, how much she loved him, how proud she was of his strength, how desperately she needed him to come home safely. Take care of yourself, she managed to say, knowing that these might be the last words they could share for a very long time. We're all waiting for you. I love you, William said, breaking protocol slightly, his voice thick with emotion. Tell the children I love them. Tell them their papa is thinking about them every day. The call ended abruptly, and Catherine sat holding the now silent device, feeling as though a part of her had been physically removed. The goodbye they had just shared was even more incomplete than their original parting, forced to be brief and inadequate by circumstances completely beyond their control. The following days passed in a blur of increasing difficulty. Catherine's meetings with other royal family members became more frequent and more pointed as William's absence stretched beyond any reasonable explanation for routine royal duties. She found herself crafting increasingly elaborate explanations, each one requiring her to remember previous lies and maintain consistency across multiple conversations. George's teacher contacted her again about his declining concentration at school. Charlotte had started asking why she couldn't call Papa like she called Grandpa and Grandmama. Louis had begun waking at night, calling for his father and unable to understand why Papa didn't come when he cried. The children's needs were becoming more acute just as Catherine's ability to meet them was being severely tested. The Queen Consort's private dinner proved to be as challenging as Catherine had feared. Sitting across from someone who had raised children in the public eye, who understood the pressures of royal marriage, who could read the signs of a woman struggling to hold her family together, Catherine found it nearly impossible to maintain her pretense that everything was normal. My dear, the Queen Consort said over dessert, her voice gentle but direct. I recognize the look of someone carrying more than she should have to bear alone. Whatever is keeping William away, you don't have to pretend with me that it's routine. Catherine felt tears threatening for the first time since the crisis had begun. The kindness and understanding in the older woman's voice touched something in her that had been carefully protected for weeks. But, even in the face of such genuine care, she couldn't break the security protocols that kept her isolated with her secret. Thank you for your concern, Catherine replied carefully. William's work is indeed challenging right now, but we're managing well as a family. The Queen Consort nodded, but Catherine could see that she wasn't convinced. Another relationship had been strained by the necessity of maintaining secrets. Another source of potential support had been held at arm's length by circumstances beyond Catherine's control. As Catherine drove home from the dinner, she realized that she was facing a sustainability crisis. The emotional and practical demands of maintaining her cover story were exceeding her ability to manage them alone. The children needed more than she could give them while carrying the burden of secrecy. Her royal duties were suffering as her concentration wavered under constant stress. Her relationships with family members were being damaged by her inability to accept their offers of support. That night, as she sat in her study waiting for a call that would not come, Catherine faced the reality that she might need to find new ways to cope with a situation that showed no signs of resolution. The goodbye spoken without words had become a separation that was testing every aspect of her strength, and she was beginning to understand that surviving this crisis would require reserves of courage she wasn't sure she possessed. The silence in the palace felt different now that even her limited contact with William had been suspended. The weight of protecting her children, maintaining her public role, and preserving the secrecy that kept William safe rested entirely on her shoulders. As she prepared for another sleepless night in their empty bedroom, Catherine wondered how many more goodbyes she would have to endure before their family could be whole again. 1 month had passed since William's disappearance from their lives, and Catherine was discovering that human endurance had limits she had never imagined testing. The woman who looked back at her from mirrors had become a stranger, hollow-eyed, thinner, moving through her days with the mechanical precision of someone operating on willpower alone. The carefully constructed normalcy she had maintained was beginning to crack in ways that could no longer be hidden. The morning brought devastating news delivered with Sir James Whitmore's characteristic directness. The primary suspect in the threat against William had been cornered by law enforcement, but, instead of surrendering, he had triggered what appeared to be a dead man's switch. Intelligence agencies were now dealing with the possibility that other members of his network, previously unknown, had been activated with instructions to carry out the original plan if he was captured or killed. Catherine listened to this briefing in the same secure room where she had first learned about the threat, but now the sterile environment felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on her as Sir James explained that William's security situation had become even more precarious, requiring his relocation to a facility with military-level protection. Communication would be suspended indefinitely, with no exceptions for family emergencies or special circumstances. "How long?" Catherine asked, her voice barely recognizable even to herself. Sir James's expression was grave. "Your Royal Highness, I cannot provide a timeline. The investigation has become international in scope, involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. We're essentially starting over with a threat that may be larger and more sophisticated than we initially understood." The words fell on Catherine like physical blows. 1 month had nearly broken her. The prospect of months or even years of this separation felt impossible to comprehend. She thought of the children, who had already begun to adapt to their father's absence in ways that broke her heart. George had stopped mentioning the school events he wanted Papa to attend. Charlotte had taken down the family photograph from her bedside table. Louis had begun calling William the Papa who went away, as if he were a character from a story rather than his living father. That afternoon, Catherine faced a crisis she had been dreading but somehow hadn't adequately prepared for. Charlotte's teacher, Mrs. Davies, had requested an urgent meeting about concerning changes in Charlotte's behavior and academic performance. As Catherine sat in the small conference room at the school, she realized that her efforts to protect the children from the truth had failed in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Princess Charlotte has always been one of our most engaged students," Mrs. Davies began, her tone carefully professional but tinged with genuine concern. "However, over the past month, we've noticed significant changes. Her grades have declined. She's become withdrawn from her classmates. And yesterday she told our counselor that her family was broken and that she didn't know when or if it would be fixed." Catherine felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her chair. Charlotte, her bright, resilient daughter, was suffering in ways that Catherine had failed to recognize or address. The 8-year-old had somehow intuited that her father's absence was not the routine royal duty her mother had described, and the uncertainty was manifesting in ways that required professional intervention. "Has she spoken specifically about her father's absence?" Catherine asked, dreading the answer. Mrs. Davies consulted her notes with the careful attention of someone discussing a sensitive topic. "She's mentioned that Papa is hiding somewhere, and that Mama cries at night when she thinks no one can hear. She's also expressed worry that something terrible might happen to him, though she couldn't explain why she felt this way." The revelation that Charlotte had heard her crying was devastating. Catherine had believed she was protecting the children by maintaining her composure in their presence, but Charlotte had apparently been more observant than anyone had realized. The image of her daughter lying in bed, listening to her mother's muffled sobs and trying to make sense of a situation no child should have to understand, made Catherine feel like she was failing in the most fundamental aspects of motherhood. The meeting with Mrs. Davies concluded with recommendations for counseling services and closer monitoring of Charlotte's emotional state. Catherine agreed to everything while knowing that the very interventions being suggested could potentially expose the secret she was fighting to protect. Each attempt to help her children seemed to create new risks to their safety. The drive home from school was conducted in silence, with Charlotte staring out the window with an expression far too serious for a child her age. When they arrived at the palace, Charlotte finally spoke, her words cutting through Catherine's heart like glass. "Mama, Is Papa ever coming home? Or are you just saying that because you don't want me to be sad? The directness of the question, asked with the clarity that only children possessed, left Catherine momentarily speechless. Charlotte deserved honesty, but honesty could endanger them all. The truth could provide comfort or create terror. Catherine found herself paralyzed between her instincts as a mother and her obligations as a protector of state secrets. Papa is coming home, Catherine said finally, kneeling down to meet Charlotte's eyes. I don't know exactly when, but I promise you that he wants to be here with us more than anything in the world. Charlotte studied her mother's face with the intensity of someone trying to determine if she was being told the truth. After a long moment, she nodded slowly, but Catherine could see that her daughter's faith in parental promises had been shaken by weeks of uncertainty and partial truths. That evening, Catherine received an encrypted message through the secure communication system, the first contact from William since his relocation to military protection. The message was brief and formal, clearly composed under strict supervision, but she read it dozens of times, searching for hidden meanings in every carefully chosen word. The message confirmed that he was safe and well cared for, but it also revealed the depth of his isolation. He had no access to news about his family, no knowledge of how the children were coping, no information about Catherine's own struggles. He was living in a vacuum, protected but completely cut off from the life he was being protected for. Catherine composed her reply with the same careful attention, knowing that every word would be scrutinized by security personnel. She wanted to tell him about Charlotte's troubles at school, about George's nightmares, about Louis's regression, but she also wanted to shield him from worries he couldn't address from his secure location. The message she finally sent was loving but sanitized, presenting a version of their family's coping that was more hopeful than accurate. The following week brought a development that changed the entire dynamic of Catherine's situation. King Charles requested a formal meeting with the security team, having apparently reached the conclusion that William's absence was not what it appeared to be. The king's position in the royal hierarchy meant that security protocols that applied to other family members could not be used to exclude him from information about threats to the heir to the throne. Catherine was present for this briefing, watching as William's father learned about the danger his son was facing and the measures being taken to protect him. The king's reaction was a mixture of anger at not being informed earlier, worry about William's safety, and understanding of the impossible position Catherine had been placed in by the security requirements. My daughter-in-law has been carrying this burden alone for over a month, the king said to Sir James, his voice tight, with controlled emotion. While I understand the need for security, isolating her from family support has created additional problems that could have been avoided. The king's intervention resulted in some modifications to the security protocols. Catherine would now be able to receive limited updates about William's condition and well-being, though direct communication would still be impossible. More importantly, the king would provide cover for William's continued absence by taking on some of his public duties and creating official explanations for his unavailability. This development provided some relief for Catherine, but it also highlighted how the secrecy requirements had unnecessarily complicated her situation. The support that family members could have provided had been withheld based on security assessments that proved to be overly restrictive. Catherine wondered how many other aspects of the crisis were being managed with unnecessary difficulty because of protocols that prioritized secrecy over practical considerations. The next challenge came from an unexpected source. Pippa, Catherine's sister, arrived at the palace unannounced and demanded to speak with Catherine privately. The weeks of being shut out had clearly taken their toll on Pippa, and she was no longer willing to accept vague explanations for her sister's obvious distress and her brother-in-law's prolonged absence. Kate, I know something is seriously wrong, Pippa said as they sat in the garden, away from staff and potential surveillance. You look terrible. The children are clearly struggling, and William has essentially vanished from public life. I'm not leaving here until you tell me what's really happening. Catherine found herself facing a choice between maintaining security protocols and accepting the support she desperately needed. Pippa was family, someone who had always been trustworthy, someone whose help could make a real difference in managing the children's needs. The rigid adherence to secrecy was creating more problems than it was solving. After consulting with the security team, Catherine was given permission to share limited information with Pippa under strict confidentiality agreements. The relief of finally being able to speak honestly with someone outside the official security apparatus was overwhelming. Pippa's reaction was shock, anger at the situation, and immediate offers of practical help that Catherine hadn't realized how desperately she needed. Pippa took on some of the day-to-day childcare responsibilities, allowing Catherine to focus more attention on George and Charlotte's emotional needs while ensuring that Louis received the consistency and attention he required. Having family support also provided cover for Catherine's own struggles, as Pippa could explain Catherine's stress as normal family pressures rather than something more serious. The children responded positively to their aunt's increased presence, and Catherine began to see improvements in their behavior and mood. George started sleeping better when he could share his worries with Aunt Pippa during bedtime stories. Charlotte's grades stabilized when she had someone to help with homework while Mama dealt with royal business. Louis thrived with the additional attention and consistency in his routine. However, even with family support, Catherine was struggling with the fundamental challenge of indefinite separation from William. The secure messages they exchanged were formal and infrequent, providing little of the emotional connection that had sustained their marriage through previous challenges. She found herself grieving not just his absence, but the loss of their partnership, their daily conversations, their ability to face problems together. One evening, as Catherine sat alone in their bedroom after another difficult day of managing family, royal duties, and the ongoing deception about William's whereabouts, she realized that she was fundamentally changed by this experience. The woman who had woken up that morning 5 weeks earlier had been confident in her ability to handle whatever challenges royal life might present. The woman she was becoming understood that some situations exceeded any individual's capacity to manage alone. The secure communication device remained silent on her nightstand, no longer a source of hope for contact, but a reminder of the communication they had lost. Catherine thought about the last conversation they had shared, how they had tried to pack a lifetime of love and support into a few carefully monitored minutes. That goodbye spoken without words had been forced to sustain them both far longer than either of them had imagined possible. As she prepared for another night of restless sleep, Catherine wondered if the person she was becoming through this ordeal would be someone William would recognize when he finally returned home. The crisis was changing her in ways she couldn't fully understand, teaching her about reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, while also showing her the limits of what any person could endure alone. The children's needs, the royal duties, the family relationships, the constant vigilance required to maintain security, all of it was reshaping her understanding of herself and her capabilities. The goodbye they had shared had been the beginning not just of a separation, but of a transformation that would affect every aspect of their lives even after the threat had passed, and their family was reunited. In the darkness of her bedroom, surrounded by evidence of a life interrupted but not destroyed, Catherine continued to wait for news that would bring William home safely and allow them to discover together who they had become during their time apart. 7 weeks had passed since that morning when Catherine's world had changed forever, and she was beginning to understand that some transformations could never be undone, regardless of how the crisis eventually resolved. The woman looking back at her from the mirror each morning bore little resemblance to the person she had been before this ordeal began. The changes weren't just physical, though the weight loss and stress lines were obvious enough. The real transformation was deeper, in the way she carried herself, in the careful calculation behind every word she spoke, in the constant awareness that safety was fragile and could be shattered without warning. The morning that would change everything began like all the others had for weeks, with Catherine mechanically going through the routines that held her family together while waiting for news that never came. She had learned to exist in a state of suspended animation, maintaining the functions of daily life, while her emotional core remained frozen in the moment of that last phone call with William. The children had adapted in ways that were both heartening and heartbreaking. George had assumed responsibilities beyond his years, helping his younger siblings and never complaining about his father's absence. Charlotte had developed a brittle cheerfulness that was painful to watch, always asking if there was anything she could do to help Mama. Louis had stopped asking for Papa altogether, which Catherine found more disturbing than his previous tears. The secure communication device had been silent for over 2 weeks, not even the formal messages that had provided minimal connection with William. Catherine had been told that even written communication had become too risky as security agencies worked to unravel what had proven to be a more complex and dangerous network than anyone had initially realized. At precisely 11 o'clock that morning, Sir James Whitmore arrived at Kensington Palace with an expression Catherine had never seen on his face before. Not the careful neutrality he usually maintained during security briefings, not the controlled concern that had marked the most difficult updates, but something that looked almost like relief mixed with caution. "Your Royal Highness," Sir James began as they settled into the familiar secure conference room, "I have significant news about the investigation. The primary suspect was found dead in his cell 3 days ago, an apparent suicide. More importantly, we've successfully apprehended the remaining members of his network, including 2 individuals who were actively preparing to carry out operations against the prince." Catherine felt the words wash over her without immediate comprehension. After weeks of bad news and increased restrictions, the concept that the situation might actually be improving seemed impossible to process. She had become so accustomed to preparing herself for worse developments that the possibility of resolution felt surreal. "What does this mean for William?" she asked, afraid to hope but unable to suppress the desperate need for good news. "The threat has been effectively neutralized," Sir James continued, consulting the papers in front of him with obvious satisfaction. "We've recovered detailed plans, communication records, and evidence that confirms we've identified all active participants in the conspiracy. The prince can be safely returned to his normal life and duties." The room seemed to spin around Catherine as she absorbed this information. After 7 weeks of living in constant fear, of maintaining impossible secrets, of watching her children suffer through their father's unexplained absence, the nightmare was finally ending. But the relief was tempered by the realization that she didn't know how to return to normal life after such an extended period of crisis. When Catherine managed to ask, her voice barely controlled, "He's being transported back to London as we speak," Sir James replied. "He should arrive at Kensington Palace within the next few hours." Catherine felt tears threatening for the first time since the crisis had begun, but they were tears of relief mixed with overwhelming anxiety. After 7 weeks of separation, she wasn't sure who either of them had become during their time apart. The woman who had said goodbye to William was different from the woman who would welcome him home. Their marriage had been tested in ways she had never imagined possible, and she didn't know what they would find when they tried to rebuild their life together. The hours that followed passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Catherine dismissed the staff early, wanting privacy for the family reunion that would need careful management. She prepared the children gradually, explaining that Papa would be coming home that evening from his long work assignment. Their reactions ranged from George's careful skepticism to Charlotte's explosive joy to Louis's confusion about who this Papa person was who would suddenly be returning to their lives. Catherine found herself obsessively checking her appearance, changing clothes multiple times, unable to settle on how she wanted William to see her when he walked through their door. The woman he had left behind would have laughed at such vanity, but the woman she had become understood that first impressions after trauma could set the tone for everything that followed. As evening approached, Catherine gathered the children in the main sitting room, the same room where they had spent countless peaceful evenings as a family before the crisis began. The familiar space felt different now, charged with anticipation and anxiety about how they would function as a family unit after such a prolonged separation. The sound of cars arriving outside sent Catherine's heart racing, but she forced herself to remain seated with the children, not wanting to appear desperate or out of control when William first saw them. She heard footsteps in the hallway, familiar voices speaking in low tones, the soft sound of the front door opening and closing. Then, William appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, and Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. He looked older, thinner, marked by his own version of the stress they had all endured. His eyes swept the room, taking in his family as though he was trying to convince himself they were real, before settling on Catherine's face with an expression of profound relief and uncertainty. For a moment, no one moved. 7 weeks of separation had created a distance that couldn't be bridged by simply being in the same room again. The children, who had been so excited about Papa's return, suddenly seemed unsure of themselves in the presence of a father who felt like a stranger after such a long absence. Louis was the first to break the tableau, toddling toward William with the fearless curiosity of a toddler who had forgotten his previous shyness around this tall man who claimed to be Papa. William sank to his knees, gathering his youngest son into his arms with tears streaming down his face, and the spell that had frozen the rest of the family was broken. George approached next, more cautiously, studying his father's face as though memorizing it before allowing himself to believe that this reunion was real and permanent. Charlotte hung back, uncharacteristically shy, until William opened his arms to include her in the embrace with her brothers. Catherine remained seated, watching her family reconnect while struggling with her own complex emotions. Relief that William was safe, joy that their family was whole again, but also apprehension about how they would navigate the aftermath of such a traumatic separation. She had become accustomed to managing alone, to making decisions without consultation, to carrying burdens that couldn't be shared. Learning to be part of a partnership again would require adjustments she wasn't sure she was ready to make. William's eyes met hers over the children's heads, and in that look she saw her own mixture of relief and uncertainty reflected back at her. They had both been changed by this experience, had both survived something that had tested every aspect of their strength and character. The question now was whether they could find their way back to each other across the distance that trauma had created between them. The children eventually tired of clinging to their returned father and wandered off to play, allowing Catherine and William to face each other alone for the first time in 7 weeks. The silence that stretched between them was filled with everything they needed to say and couldn't find words for. "Kate," William said finally, his voice rough with emotion and disuse. "Welcome home," Catherine replied, the simple words carrying the weight of everything she had endured in his absence. They moved toward each other slowly, as though approaching something fragile that might break if handled roughly. When William's arms finally closed around her, Catherine felt herself dissolving into tears she had held back for weeks. All the strength she had maintained, all the composure she had projected, all the careful control she had exercised, all of it crumbled in the safety of her husband's embrace. William held her while she wept, his own tears falling silently as he absorbed the reality of what she had suffered during his absence. He could feel how much weight she had lost, could sense the brittle quality of her strength, could understand without words that she had paid a heavy price for maintaining their family's stability while he was gone. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her hair. "I'm so sorry you had to do this alone." Catherine pulled back to look at his face, seeing her own changes reflected in his eyes. "We survived," she said simply. "We all survived." The conversation that followed was halting and careful, as they attempted to share their experiences of separation without overwhelming each other with the full weight of what they had endured. William described the isolation, the helplessness of being unable to contact his family, the constant worry about their safety and well-being. Catherine spoke about the children's struggles, the impossible balancing act of maintaining secrecy while providing stability, the family relationships that had been strained by her inability to accept support. As they talked, Catherine began to understand that their goodbye spoken without words had become something more profound than a temporary parting. It had been the end of one version of their marriage and the beginning of another. They had both learned things about themselves and each other that couldn't be unlearned, had both developed strengths and vulnerabilities that would shape their relationship going forward. The children's bedtime routine that evening was both precious and challenging. Louis needed time to reacquaint himself with Papa's voice reading bedtime stories. Charlotte wanted to show William every project and drawing she had created during his absence, seeking validation that he still loved her despite their time apart. George asked careful questions about where Papa had been and whether he would have to go away again, needing reassurance that the family's stability had been restored. When the children were finally settled, Catherine and William found themselves alone in their bedroom for the first time in 7 weeks. The space felt both familiar and foreign, marked by the absence they had endured and the uncertainty about how to move forward together. They talked deep into the night, sharing details and emotions they hadn't been able to communicate through the limited channels available during the separation. William learned about Charlotte's struggles at school, about George's nightmares, about Louis's regression. Catherine learned about the isolation William had experienced, the constant fear for his family's safety, the helplessness of being unable to participate in the life he was being protected for. As dawn approached, they reached a new understanding about their relationship and their family. The crisis had changed them both in fundamental ways, but it had also demonstrated the strength of their commitment to each other and their children. They had survived something that could have destroyed their marriage, and while they would need time to fully heal from the trauma, they were both committed to rebuilding their life together. The goodbye spoken without words that had begun this ordeal had been transformed into a reunion that was equally profound in its silence. They didn't need words to express their relief, their gratitude, their renewed commitment to protecting what they had built together. The experience had taught them that love could endure separation, that family bonds could survive secrets, and that strength could be found in the most desperate circumstances. In the weeks that followed William's return, the family slowly found their new normal. The children's confidence in their father's presence gradually returned. The secrets that had isolated Catherine were replaced by shared knowledge of what they had all endured. The marriage that had been tested by separation and silence grew stronger through the careful work of rebuilding trust and intimacy. The most emotional moment of their entire ordeal hadn't been the goodbye that started it or the reunion that ended it, but the gradual realization that they had been transformed by their experience into something more resilient, more appreciative of their time together, and more committed to facing future challenges as a united family. The goodbyes spoken without words had taught them that love could survive anything, even separation that seemed to threaten the very foundation of their relationship. In learning to live apart, they had discovered new depths to their connection that would sustain them through whatever challenges royal life might bring in the future. Their family had been tested in the most extreme circumstances and had emerged not unscathed, but undeniably stronger.